Israel breaking the ceasefire between them and Hamas and restarting the genocide that they are committing against the Palestinian people.
We have breaking news at this hour. The Israeli military says they are currently conducting extensive strikes in Gaza. The Israeli Defense Forces and Israeli Securities Agency say they are targeting terror targets belonging to Hamas. The strikes throw into doubt the fragile ceasefire that is held for nearly 2 months. The attacks come after President Trump issued what he called a last warning to Hamas last week to release all the remaining hostages being held in Gaza. The president said the U.S. was giving its full support to Israel to, quote, finish the job if the hostages were not freed. And just a short while ago, President Netanyahu said Israel will increase its use of force against Hamas going forward, accusing Hamas of repeatedly refusing to release the hostages and rejecting mediation offers. Here to discuss how the ceasefire agreement could fall apart and Israel's next steps.
Pardon me for coughing there. I'm pausing because we need to mention how Israel has since killed upwards of 400 Palestinians in the 24 or 48 hours since it's been reported that they have violated the ceasefire. Keep in mind that Israel was still conducting airstrikes after the first phase of a ceasefire had been reached. I don't know how this now formally violates it. I guess because Israel claims that Hamas formally violated the terms of the ceasefire. But yeah, it's really gross that it's almost 60 seconds into the start of this story, and the newscaster here has not mentioned how Israel had killed hundreds of Palestinians.
Is ABC News correspondent Matt Gutman, who joins us by phone right now. Matt, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu just told the public why the ceasefire agreement broke down. Can you share that with us?
He basically said that Hamas, Stephanie, did not accept this Witkoff proposal. They've been talking about this for a couple of weeks now. It seems that they got close at some point. It also seems that the U.S. had been engaged in direct talks with Hamas for the first time separately from Israel. It's the first time that any U.S. administration had ever reached out and spoke directly to Hamas. Those apparently also broke down. And so at this point, the Israeli Prime Minister alerting the military, but also obviously the public, that the ceasefire has broken down. In fact, I spoke to a military official about 30 seconds before we got on air, who said that we've been in negotiations with Hamas. That wasn't working. The question now, Stephanie, is how extensive is this attack going to be? Is this just like a shot across the bow? Is this airstrikes that we're going to see tonight going into tomorrow? Or are we going to see tanks roll across the border into Gaza again, and at what strength? So
this is a great segue into this tweet I have pulled up in this tab, courtesy of Dropsite News, that has a quote from Israel's new defense minister, Heinrich Himmler, wherein he says the following: residents of Gaza, this is your final warning. The first Sinwar destroyed Gaza, and the second will bring upon it total ruin. The Israeli Air Force's attack against Hamas terrorists was only the first step. What follows will be harsher, and you will bear the cost. This guy is talking and admitting that the IDF is going to kill civilians explicitly. There is no word to describe how heinous these actions are. There is no way to articulate how abhorrent all of these people are. Prison is not an appropriate punishment. I don't know what the consequence is. Like, prison is the bare minimum for these people. To be so brazen about your genocide highlights where we are at in the world today, because you should not, like, the fact that you can openly talk about this and face no consequences is it's sickening. It's depraved. It's Gross. He continues. Evacuation of the population from combat zones will soon resume. If all Israeli hostages are not released and Hamas is not kicked out of Gaza, Israel will act with force you have not known before. Take the advice of the U.S. president, return the hostages and kick out Hamas, and new options will open up for you, including relocation to other parts of the world for those who choose. The alternative is destruction and total devastation. This fucking asshole, this ghoul, this goblin, this supervillain is telling the Palestinian people that you will either be ethnically cleansed or ethnically displaced. You will either be forcibly removed from your home or you will have a fucking bomb dropped on you. I understand that the video we're watching, courtesy of ABC, this clip is before this tweet came out, but I would be hard pressed to see a Western aligned media outlet talking about these words, these specific words. This guy actively telling the world that Israel is going to kill more Palestinian civilians, that they are entering their final solution. Let's get back to ABC now.
I was just got back from Israel on Saturday night, and multiple military sources there had been talking about another massive invasion of the Gaza Strip to rid Gaza of Hamas once and for all. And they said instead of sort of the whack-a-mole that Israel had been playing with Hamas, where it would strike one area and then Hamas would pop up somewhere else, because Israel was engaged in multiple fronts at one time, fighting in Gaza, but also in Lebanon. This time they're going to focus all the forces inside Gaza at once and try to truly decimate the terrorist organization. However, obviously they've proven very elusive, and we've seen in these ceremonies that Hamas has come out in these crisp uniforms, AK-47s oiled up. They have new vehicles that appear unblemished from 18 months of war. So the question is, how extensive is this, and how long does it last? At this point, we simply don't know. But this is certainly the biggest military operation that we've seen in 2 months in the Gaza Strip.
And Matt, those are certainly some really strong and solid questions. How extensive will these strikes be? We know that the IDF says they are conducting extensive strikes right now on Gaza as we speak. But what are their goals militarily speaking?
It sounds very easy to say, Stephanie, and we've heard this from Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu so many times, right? It's to destroy Hamas. The question is, what does that look like? And the biggest question that Israelis are asking is public, what happens to the hostages? You fought this war to repatriate the hostages. You entered those negotiations to repatriate those hostages, but where are they? So there are 59 hostages, living and dead. A very senior source told me that Israel believes at this point that there are only 21 living hostages, and it seems that Israel may be willing to roll the dice here. Unclear how far they're willing to go and risk the lives of the remaining hostages in order to try to hit areas that they hadn't hit before, like the center of Gaza, which is largely still intact because that's where it was believed that the Israeli hostages were being held. But remember, there are American hostages, there are Argentine hostages from various nations who have dual Israeli and other citizenship. So it's very complicated, and many Israeli rank and file folks are just wondering, well, what's going to happen? Are these other people?
I disagree with this gentleman. I don't think it's very complicated. It's quite cut and dry, actually. And it's that Benjamin Netanyahu and all of the senior members of his cabinet want to perpetuate this assault on the Palestinian people at the expense of whoever the fuck happens to be in Gaza at the time. If they had an actual interest in bringing home the hostages, they would not have been so reckless with their bombings. They would not be indiscriminately bombing hospitals, mosques, schools. They wouldn't be dropping 2,000-pound bombs in an urban setting. They wouldn't have closed off all supplies and energy and food and water into Gaza. There was this comparison of the hostages that Hamas took in versus the hostages that Israel took in, and they're like, "Oh my God, the Israelis, they just look so emancipated and so gone." And it's because Benjamin Netanyahu fucking closed off the supply chain so that way provisions couldn't even reach the hostages. The goal here for Israel and for Benjamin Netanyahu is to eradicate the Palestinian people, whether that is by force or whether that is by relocation.
People going to get killed. That's a very major fear, and that's going to be very hard for Netanyahu to play. He's got a lot of pressure coming from his base to keep fighting, but a lot of the rest of Israel says, no, we need to get those hostages home any way we can, Stephanie.
Absolutely, and the families of those 59 hostages also
Exactly.
awaiting news and wanting to see their loved ones. Matt, thank you so much for your time. We want to turn now to retired General Doug Lute, a former U.S. ambassador to NATO. Sir, thanks so much for joining us. Days ago, President Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, proposed a new agreement that would last until April 20th, which detailed the release of these hostages. What could these latest strikes possibly mean for the fate of those hostages? I know Matt just touched on it a few moments ago. But what could this mean for those individuals, dead or alive?
Well, I think what we've seen, if these reports are right, and if the early reports that Israel is going to resume full-scale military operations prove accurate, it proves that these sorts of ceasefire deals, like this one, which is now 2 months old, are exceptionally fragile. And they're fragile because neither party, in this case, neither the Israelis nor Hamas, have any reason to trust one another. So there's no trust. And
Breaking. The sun is orange and it's hot. Except the ceasefire deal in this instance is fragile because the United States is not willing to strong arm the Israeli government. You could work a ceasefire if you were the president of the United States by going to Israel and saying, hey, you accept the terms of this deal, or we're going to cut off weapons and aid to you. Israel cannot conduct what they're doing without the United States. The economy of Israel in some instances cannot function without the United States. Forget the genocide that the US is aiding and abetting. But neither Joe Biden nor Donald Trump was willing to do that. In fact, both parties here in the US are pretty much in agreement with how to deal with this ceasefire. Let Israel do whatever the fuck it wants, which is violate the ceasefire and or reject the terms of the ceasefire like it had done at the beginning of their onslaught, and just allow them to eradicate the Palestinians from existence. That is the United States government uniparty view on this this set of affairs.
the slightest wrinkle in the pattern, the phased approach.
It is worth noting as well that a stipulation in the latest ceasefire was that Israel withdraw all troops from Gaza. And you know what Israel said about that? That is too radical. Those wants are too extreme. It is too extreme for Israel to pull out of the area that they are occupying. They are simply a disingenuous actor. Anyone who doesn't see that is being ignorant. They are either ignorant or they are uninformed on the situation.
Ceasefire. The slightest wrinkle, the slightest dismissal can lead to a renewed conflict. And I think that may be what we're seeing. We should remember that this phase one of the ceasefire was supposed to have been completed 2 weeks ago on March 1st. So we may see a return to full-scale violence. And of course, that spells a disaster for the remaining hostages and for the prospect that eventually a peace could be brought to bear on this conflict.
And Israelis
Also, really fucking gross that the three people that have spoken during this entire segment do not even recognize the Palestinian civilians in this situation. There's been no fucking. Yeah, this guy is like, oh my god, the violence would be unimaginable for the hostages. What about the fucking 50,000 to 250,000 Palestinians that have already fucking died? And the potential 100,000 more that Israel is going to kill? Is the violence not bad for them? Is it only bad for the hostages? It's also worth noting that Israel has taken in considerably more hostages than Hamas has. We have an article courtesy of the BBC right up here that we will get to once the segment is done. Israel has taken 1,900 hostages. Hamas has taken about 60.
have always wanted eradication of Hamas, but they're still in Gaza. Could this war continue until Hamas is completely out of the picture?
Well, I think that what we're coming to grips with is that the complete destruction of Hamas is likely beyond the military capability of the state of Israel. Unless Israel is going to fully occupy Gaza indefinitely and rule it, it is almost impossible to eradicate completely Hamas. And we've seen reminders of this. As your report indicated just a few minutes ago,
I'm going to tweak because all of these people that are like related, tangentially related to U.S. foreign policy, seemingly have no fucking idea how we're going to call it counterterrorism works in this regard, because Hamas is considered a terrorist group. But it doesn't even have to be a terrorist group. It can be any resistance group at all. The Viet Cong, the Taliban, the forces that the U.S. fought in Iraq and Afghanistan. When you have a group like that, you will never be able to fully eradicate them militarily, not because of a lack of capability, but because every time you kill someone's aunt or their mom or their fucking sibling, you create another member of that group. If you want to get rid of this perceived terrorist threat, you have to do it diplomatically. Antony Blinken has, courtesy of U.S. intelligence, said that there are about as many Hamas members now than there was at the beginning of the genocide. There's still around 20,000 Hamas members. It's because the continuation of violence and the perpetual genocide only fosters more resistance. This goes, again, for any sort of group that is being oppressed.
Reminder that Hamas persists. Hamas has survived, and Hamas has made a very public display of this over the last several weeks, as hostages have been step by step released and so forth. There have been Hamas fighters there brandishing weapons and so forth, and demonstrating to Israel, but also to the people of Gaza, that Hamas is not destroyed. So this is really the rub of the problem.
And we know that Prime Minister Netanyahu says that for now they will increase, of course, these forces against Hamas because Hamas has not released the remaining hostages and refused mediation offers. Do you see any path forward for mediation at this point to ensure that a ceasefire holds?
Well, look, mediation with the good offices of nearby states, so Qatar and Egypt, with the U.S. participating, got us to phase one and brought us the promise, or at least the prospect that we could go from phase one to phase two and eventually phase three, a long-lasting peaceful arrangement in post-war Gaza. But again, I think if the ceasefire breaks down, it is a vivid reminder of just how delicate these ceasefires are, and not only the ceasefire here, but the ceasefire that might be in the works elsewhere, for example, in Ukraine.
Retired General Doug Lute, a former U.S.
It's worth mentioning as well that Netanyahu will never accept this ceasefire, not just for military reasons, but also for political reasons. The other coalitions in his government will effectively break down and force an election if Benjamin Netanyahu does not keep this quote-unquote war going on, because that's how the Israeli government sees it. They see this as a war on Hamas. And if at any point that stops, Benjamin Netanyahu is liable to get voted out of office. He is perpetuating this war not only because he is a rabid genocidal Zionist, but also because he wants to remain in power. Even if the ceasefire went to phase 2, that would be enough for the surrounding coalitions to break down and force an election. We're now going to jump on over to this article, courtesy of the BBC. It asks, is the war starting again in Gaza? A ceasefire, which had halted fighting between Israel and Hamas for 2 months, appears to be over following an intense wave of airstrikes by Israel on what it said were Hamas targets in the Gaza Strip. The ceasefire laid out a path for permanently ending the war and had seen the release of hostages held by Hamas in exchange for Palestinian prisoners held by Israel. Already, we can see how the verbiage is going to be pro-Israel by them saying that the Israelis taken were hostages, but the Palestinians taken were prisoners. That is already slanted framing of the situation, and that will come up multiple times in this article. The war was triggered, not a war, when Hamas attacked Israel on October 7th, killing about 1,200 people and taking 251 back to Gaza as captives. Also worth mentioning that on October 7th, Israel implemented the Hannibal Directive, and there's no telling how many innocent Israeli civilians they killed on that night. Israel responded with a massive military offensive, which killed more than 48,500 Palestinians. Gaza's Hamas Foreign Health Ministry says that number is underestimated by 40% at least, and could be as high as 250,000 when you account for all of the indirect casualties by way of Israel not letting in food, medical supplies, cutting off electricity, things of that nature. Why has Israel launched airstrikes? Israeli aircraft began attacking what the military said were Hamas targets across Gaza in the early hours of March 18th. It was the most extensive series of airstrikes since the ceasefire began on January 19th. The Israeli military described the action as, quote, preemptive strikes based on Hamas's readiness to execute terror attacks, build up force, and rearm. At the same time, the Israeli Prime Minister's office said the action was ordered after Hamas's, quote, repeated refusal to release their hostages and its rejection of the new ceasefire proposals by the U.S. and mediators. Hamas reacted furiously, accusing Israel of having, quote, decided to overturn the ceasefire agreement. The ceasefire has been under increasing strain for several weeks, during which time indirect talks between Israel and Hamas about moving forward had reached an impasse. Is the ceasefire over? It has not been declared over, though in practice the attacks by Israel mean the truce is no longer. Mediators, though, the U.S., Qatar, and Egypt, which spent months brokering the ceasefire, will almost certainly intensify efforts to salvage the agreement. Israel, however, has warned its new offensive will, quote, continue as long as necessary and will expand beyond airstrikes, suggesting plans for renewed military actions on the ground. The Israeli Prime Minister's office said the attacks that began on the 18th of March were being carried out, quote, in order to achieve the objectives of the war. These have been previously declared as the return of all hostages, the dismantling of Hamas's governing and military capabilities, and the removal of any future threat from Gaza. We're going to skip ahead to what the ceasefire actually entails. Stage 1, by the way, this is the proposal that was set out by Joe Biden in May of last year. The same proposal that Israel had rejected multiple times, and the only time they accepted it was when after Donald Trump had won the election, because Bibi Netanyahu and Donald Trump are secretly in love with each other. And if they're not in love with each other, they are definitely each other's best friends. The deal was a 3-stage deal. Or a 3-phase deal. This has been widely reported. The first phase, which lasted 42 days, said this: Hamas released 25 living Israeli hostages and 8 dead hostages. Israel released about 1,900 Palestinians from Gaza. This ratio is off. Why the fuck are there 1,000 more, 1,000 times more hostages taken by Israel than Hamas? Why? Is it because that maybe, Israel is an apartheid state and that any fucking Arab who lives in Israel is subject to being swept up in a fucking raid at any point? Israeli forces left populated areas of Gaza. Displaced Palestinians returned to their neighborhoods. Hundreds of aid lorries, were allowed into Gaza each day. By the way, like, stuff like this, for example, the amount of aid let in was cut off at certain points leading up to the ceasefire by Israel and Benjamin Netanyahu. And when Joe Biden learned about this, he did fucking nothing. In fact, when Joe Biden learned that Netanyahu was restricting the flow of aid to only like a couple dozen trucks instead of a couple hundred trucks, he gave Israel more money and more weapons. They have been emboldened by the United States to do what they are doing. Israeli troops remained in Gaza's border areas, including the southern Philadelphia corridor. Why is it called that? And left the Netzarim corridor, a military zone cutting the north of Gaza off from the south. Stage 2. Negotiations of the second stage were meant to begin 16 days after the start of stage 1, but that did not happen. Like stage 1, stage 2 was also meant to be completed within 42 days. According to the ceasefire deal, under stage 2, quote, a permanent ceasefire will be established. Remaining living hostages in Gaza will be exchanged for more Palestinian prisoners. Israeli forces will make a complete withdrawal. This is the proposition that Israel felt was too radical. Just let that sit with you. The most moral army on the planet thought it was too much of an ask for them to completely remove themselves from Gaza, which, by the way, their presence in Gaza adds to more tension. It creates an astounding amount of anxiety within the Palestinian civilians. Stage 3. The final part of the ceasefire would see the return of all remaining bodies of dead hostages, the reconstruction of Gaza, which is expected to take years. Years is an understatement. There was a study done, or I guess it was a study. There was the mathematics were worked out on how long it would take to rebuild Gaza to just the GDP levels of, I think it was 2022. It would take like 350 years. 350 years. It would take the current age of the United States plus another century to rebuild Gaza, which would likely not happen because climate change would have already decimated the world's population by then. Why hasn't the ceasefire moved forward? Because Israel and Netanyahu haven't allowed it. But we're going to see what the BBC's coverage of this is. Since the 1st of March, when Stage 1 expired, the ceasefire has been in limbo. Stage 2 has not begun, even though talks were meant to have started weeks ago. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said on March 2nd that Israel had accepted a plan by U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff to, quote, extend the temporary ceasefire by 50 days to discuss the second stage. Netanyahu said that under the plan, half of the remaining hostages would be released straight away and the remainder released if an agreement was reached. Hamas said it rejected Israel's attempt to extend the first stage, calling it, quote, a blatant attempt to evade the agreement and avoid entering into negotiations for the second phase, which I already mentioned. Entering stage 2 of the ceasefire does not bode well for Netanyahu's political aspirations. The U.S., which has aligned itself with Israel more closely since Donald Trump succeeded Joe Biden, said Hamas was, quote, making a very bad bet that time is on its side. It's not. How many hostages are still held in Gaza? Israel says 59 hostages are still being held in Gaza, up to 24 of whom are believed to be alive, and at least 35 are presumed dead. The 25 hostages released under the deal included 2 Israeli soldiers, male and female Israeli citizens, and 2 children. 5 living Thai hostages were freed outside of the deal. The living hostages were released by Hamas in stage managed events in different locations in Gaza, where they were handed over to the Red Cross. The Red Cross then transferred them to Israeli forces inside Gaza before they were driven across the border into Israel and reunited with their families. The bodies of 4 hostages were also handed over in a spectacle condemned by Israel and others. 4 bodies were returned without a similar event. Who were the Palestinian hostages freed by Israel? Of course, hostages being my wording, not theirs. About 1,900 Palestinians were released in the first phase of the deal. 1,900, dude. That's so fucking insane. Many of those released in the first exchange, and some of them in the following 3 exchanges, had never been charged and were detained without trial in Israeli prisons under what it is called, quote, administrative detention, a process criticized by human rights groups. Yeah, tell me that they are not a fucking apartheid state. Oh, you happen to look somewhat Arab in Israel? Prison. That's basically what the fuck they're doing here. Oh, you look like you're a Hamas sympathizer? Prison. Others had been found guilty of serious crimes, including being convicted by Israeli courts of multiple murders. Dozens had been serving life sentences. The released prisoners have returned to the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem, and in some cases, Gaza. Dozens were deported abroad due to the gravity of their crimes. Israel insisted that no one who was involved in the October 7th attacks will be freed. The prisoners are among more than 10,000 Palestinians held by Israel, not including detainees from Gaza held by the military, held by the IDF, who have either been convicted or are suspected of security offenses. Dude, like the evidence is so fucking obvious. It's so clear. It's just so clear that Israel is a rogue nation at this point. Being arrested and detained on suspicion of security offenses is just another way of being arrested because you're an Arab. These range from bombings and other attacks to belonging to banned armed groups. More than 3,000 people are reported to be held under administrative detention. How has aid been delivered to Gaza? I think I'm gonna skip over this just because we covered some of this. Aid agencies have managed to source supplies. Some 60 to 70% of the buildings have been estimated to be damaged or destroyed. Rebuilding Gaza will be a monumental task. The UN has estimated that it will cost at least $53 billion US dollars. The human cost of the conflict will also be felt for many years to come, with tens of thousands wounded and left with complex psychological damage. There was a study done by some psychiatric institution, and it highlighted how there are children in Gaza who are born with PTSD because of the tremendous stress that their parents live under. There are children who would rather unalive themselves than be alive in Gaza. I think it's close to like 50%. Mind you, the average age in Gaza is what, 18, 17, something like that? The majority, maybe not the majority, but a sizable portion of people living in Gaza are children. 90% of the casualties are women and children. Even if Israel targeted simply Hamas, the idea that you would be the idea that you could just so inhumanely target so many innocent civilians because of Hamas is just, it's incomprehensible. Because Hamas is 1% of the population in Gaza. It's sickening. It's sickening. I feel I I feel tremendous pain for the Palestinian people because the United States could end this if they wanted to. They have all the power. They have all the leverage in this situation. Benjamin Netanyahu and Israel cannot do what they're doing without unconditional aid from the United States. And yet the last two presidents have willingly given tens of billions of dollars to a genocidal government.